Big Podcast.
It's Build a Big Podcast, the marketing podcast for podcasters. David Hooper with you. Bigpodcast.com is the site. This is not just another podcast about podcasting. I'm not talking about plugging mics in or tech. I'm talking about psychology, marketing, getting people to listen to your podcast, getting people to share your podcast. I'm going to talk about that today, strategies for you to grow your podcast audience. A lot of it's foundational and a lot of it's sticking things out, basically just showing up. But there's some little bitty tweaks you can throw in there that'll make showing up so much more effective. You don't want to be like one of these guys that has hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of episodes. But if you listen to today's episode, it's the exact same thing that number 1, number 10, number 20, number 50 was. Do the same episode every time. You want to do something that stimulates your audience. And we're going to talk about how to do that. One of those resources, I've got a book out right now. It's 101 podcast episode templates. These are things that I have worked with these are ideas that I've worked on with my private clients over the last few years. I'm now releasing them to the public. Groundbreaking? I don't know. But they can be life-changing for your podcast. And right now, the book, only 99 cents at Amazon. It is called 101 podcast episode templates. I've got links to that and more at newsletter.bigpodcast. One of the things you can do to grow your podcast is bring in your community. And in that book, 101 podcast episode templates, I've got different ways on how you can do that. And this is where I'm going to get into the tech. How do you bring in your community? What happens when you've got a community that isn't as technologically advanced as you are? You need to make things easy on them, but you don't want to make it so easy where they don't sound good. I've seen people doing things like a speakerphone from a car, or they're walking down the street, what I call a ramblecast, just to bring their audience in. Don't do that. You don't need to do that. Not with Riverside. Riverside is the leading platform to record studio quality, remote podcast, and also video. You can do it from your mobile phone. They've got an iOS app, meaning if you've got an iPhone, you're good to go. You can invite, record, and download high quality audio and video from your iPhone. In other words, if you've got somebody who's listening to you on an iPhone, that guest can use that iPhone as a studio to connect with you and be part of that podcast. It's super easy, very intuitive. You guys don't need to install anything. All you need to do is send them a link. They can join Riverside Studio directly from a browser. And once that recording is done, you'll have exactly what you need to make your audience feel like they are part of your podcast. And when they feel like they're part of your podcast, that's when they're going to start telling their friends about it. You've had it happen. You've been on a podcast before. Hey, Mom, check this out. I was on a podcast. Yeah, that's going to happen to you. Here's the deal. You can try Riverside for free. If it works for you, I've got a code for you. You'll get 15% off any membership plan. The URL is riverside.fm. Again, go there and try it for free. Here's your code. Big Podcast, one word, BIGPODCAST. You'll get 15% off any membership plan. That direct URL, riverside.fm. But like everything in this episode, you can find more details and also a direct link at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Hey, when you hear this sound, it's time to turn the page. That's the next article. You ready? Here we go. Why podcasts die. It's an interesting commentary on online communities, but it also applies just as much to your podcast itself. Why do so many podcasts die? And what's the secret ingredient behind those that succeed? Does this sound familiar to you? Your podcast had a well-intentioned and enthusiastic leader. Maybe that was you. What happened to you, man? Your podcast had early believers. You left the gate with a bang. Boom. Everybody's excited. Not so much anymore. Even with that early success, things slowed down quickly. What's the deal? I've got ideas on what the problem is and how to fix it. That is at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. 10 influencers share how to grow your email list with social media. If you've got an email list for your podcast, and you should, these are some great tips on how to grow it. Don't have an email list? Again, you should. I've got a link at newsletter.bigpodcast.com on how you can set one up very quickly. But what I'm talking about here will also work for growing your podcast subscribers. How to grow your list or subscriber base with Facebook groups. How to get more listeners and subscribers with Facebook ads. How to build an email list and increase subscribers with Instagram bios. How to do list building and subscriber building with Instagram direct messages. How to grow your list with Instagram stories. How to get more subscribers and listeners via LinkedIn events. How to build a list and get more listeners via LinkedIn featured links. You know what those are? I'm going to tell you. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. I've got info on how to attract subscribers and listeners via LinkedIn with different calls to action that you can use. Also, Twitter's Media Studio, information about that. And if you use Pinterest or you want to, I've got a way to make that work for growing your podcast audience and also your mailing list. 10 influencers share how they have done it, how you can do it too. That is at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. When is being a podcast guest a bad idea? You're here because you've got a podcast. This is going to help you in two ways. One, if you host a podcast, you've got what it takes to be a podcast guest. But also, are you doing podcast guests? I already talked to you about how to do that via Riverside, how to bring your audience in as podcast guests. I've got the 101 podcast episode templates that I mentioned. A lot of those have options for you to bring guests in. But when is being a guest on podcast a bad idea? First of all, let's talk about when it's a good idea. One, when you can identify good audience alignment. If the audience that you are broadcasting to via that podcast is in alignment with what you talk about or what you've got on your podcast. Second thing, you've got something genuinely useful to offer listeners. You know this as a podcast host. Some of the people that are approaching you about being a guest on your podcast, they don't have something genuinely helpful. That's not a good idea. And if that's the case, I hope you're not letting them on your podcast. That's a waste of your time. That's a waste of listeners' time. Third way that being a guest on podcasts is a good idea. The audience is big enough for you to reap some rewards. That is not saying that you should not be on a small podcast. Maybe you've got a small podcast. I've worked on some very small niche podcasts, but because of who they were going to, the people that they connected with, you didn't need a lot of people. Maybe you've got something like that. So that's not to say that the audience has to be huge, but the audience needs to be big enough for you to reap some rewards and make it worth your time. When is being a guest on podcast a bad idea? Tell me if this relates to you. You're expecting interviews to be a silver bullet for growth. I see this all the time because people come to me who don't have podcasts, but they want to be on podcasts. David, can you let the podcasters that you know that I'm available to be on their podcast? I got a book and I need to sell it. All right, cool. That's a part of a strategy, but that's not the strategy. And this is coming from a guy who really believes in podcasting. I love podcasting. I've written a couple books on it. Obviously, this podcast, hundreds of episodes on podcast itself, written a lot of words. I've got a newsletter about podcasting. I believe in podcasting, but it is not a silver bullet for growth. It is part of a complete strategy. And that's why in this newsletter and on this episode, which is the audio version of the newsletter, I'm talking about doing different things other than your podcast. I want you to have a complete holarchy, let's call it, of what you do to grow your business, to spread your message. And that's usually three things. One of them is something in writing. I prefer books. It could be a newsletter. It could be a blog. I like a live event component. You getting in front of people, speaking to them one-to-many. I also like, obviously, podcasting. But that's only a third of what I'm talking about if we're slicing that pie up evenly. What I have found, and this works for book series 2, by the way. It works for podcast series. It works for any kind of series that you were doing. The more you add on to what you were doing, the more powerful that original thing becomes. For example, with the book, I mentioned 101 podcast episode templates. That is book 2 of 3 in a trilogy that I have. The third one is not released. That is coming later this year. That's a podcast launch planner. The first one is a guide with my general philosophy. So I've got 2 of the 3 books out already. The third one available for pre-order. When that second book hit, and it's been out a little over a month right now, the first book went back up the charts. The third book, one of the hot new releases on Amazon. 3 books isn't 3 times more powerful than 1 book. I would say it's 10 times more powerful than 1 book. I want you to think about that when going to different types of media. If you've got a newsletter, that makes your podcast more powerful. If you've got a podcast, it makes your newsletter more powerful. So get into these different types of media. Don't just think that one thing is a silver bullet for growth. One thing is not a silver bullet. You need to do everything. And I'm not saying be everywhere. You need to be where your customers are, where your listeners are, where your readers are. But also hit them in different ways, even if they don't read your newsletter. Simply having the newsletter because they know about it, that's going to make your authority grow. So do think about that. If you're expecting interviews to be a silver bullet for growth or any one thing to be a silver bullet for that matter, it's not. Second thing, you can't find relative podcasts that are attainable. If the only podcast that is going to make a difference to you is Oprah, and there's no way that Oprah is going to interview you, maybe podcasting is not for you. The good news is I've never seen this happen. I've never seen that there is only one podcast that is going to help you get your message out. The podcasts that are available to you might not be the huge podcasts like Oprah, but this is that compounding effect that I'm talking about. If you can get 10 little podcasts, maybe that's more important to you than one big podcast like Oprah. For me, somebody trying to reach podcasters, being on Oprah, that's not going to help me unless the people that watch Oprah, and let's assume she's still on the air. I know this. Don't write me and say, David, she's not on the air anymore. She's still around. She's still a media personality. Being exposed by Oprah in some way on her magazine, on the radio network, on any of the television specials that she does, is that going to help me? Maybe. But what would help me more, even if it's a smaller list, would be to go to podcast hosting companies and work with them, people who only deal with podcasters. This is why your podcast is so powerful. If you're reaching one type of person in your audience, somebody who's really specialized on one thing, if you've got a sponsor that wants to work with you, that ad space that that sponsor comes to you for, that's going to be more valuable than a general audience ad space, which is what you get when you get something like Oprah. By the way, the next issue of Big Podcast Insider, it's going to be available in audio. So make sure you're on the feed, bigpodcast.com/subscribe. I'm talking all about those brand deals and how to do them. Third element of why podcast guesting is a bad idea. You're already stretched too thin. You've got too few resources to dedicate time to doing interviews. At that point, focusing on your own podcast should always be the priority. This is a well-worn cliche, but it fits here. When you're about ready to take off in an airplane, they're giving you the safety instructions. They say, put your mask on first. If you don't have oxygen, you're not going to be able to help the people around you who don't have oxygen. If you don't have power in your house, you're not going to be able to help the people around you who don't have power. So you need to get your own podcast in order, your own media in order, before you put your message into the hands of others. Who knows what they're going to do? I've done a lot of interviews. They never get released. You probably have too. And maybe you've been on both sides of that. You've been an interviewee and you've been an interviewer that's done interviews that have not been released. I certainly have. So when is being a podcast guest a bad idea? I got more thoughts. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. What if money didn't matter? What if it didn't matter? We hear that question a lot, and most people agree with it in theory, but there's still a ton of podcasters that are chasing the money, talking about various topics and interviewing people whom they have no interest in except for the money. I know people that go against their own best interest to make money. I know a trans woman doing some stuff for a very conservative political outfit. They are anti-trans. They don't mind paying this lady to get help to spread their message, and she's making money. But what she is doing beyond making that money is going against her own interest. And that may be the same case with you and your podcast. What if money did not matter? And I get it. We've all got to survive. I'm not making judgment on this. Do what you do to survive. But are you really happy? It's something for you to think about. I've got a short video. It's just 3 minutes long, and it may be the kick in the pants that you need to do the podcast that lights you up. Don't just chase the money. Let the money come to you. The money is there. That's actually what I'm going to talk about on the next episode of Build a Big Podcast. How to set your podcast up and how to set yourself up where brand deals come to you. And when brand deals come to you, they're paying you more money. It works almost the opposite of that when you chase after something. The same is true for your happiness. The same is true for how you feel about making your podcast. What if money didn't matter? Let's think about that. I want to help you spread a message that works for you. And I'm not saying that that cannot be a conservative message, by the way. If conservatism works for you, hey, by all means, do it. But you need to be doing something that works for you, not chasing the money if you want to be happy, if you want to be engaged, if you want to enjoy the work that you are doing. Life is too short to be doing work that we do not like, even if it's podcasting and even if we like podcasting. You ever had those interviews like, oh, I don't want to go interview this guy. It's not lighting me up. I've been self-employed for 25 years. I don't think that every single thing that you do, every moment of the day has to be completely engaging and incredibly enjoyable. That's not realistic. But overall, you should feel good about the podcast that you are doing. And I want you to understand that there are ways for you to make money doing the podcast that you want to do. Again, I got a quick 3-minute video for you to watch. I think it's going to be inspiring to you. That is linked, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. One more thing for you in this issue. Let's talk about making your audio sound its best. $59 for life. That is what this is going to cost you. It's called Bouncecast. It is similar to Auphonic, and it uses intelligent audio processing to optimize the sound of your recordings. Let's say you've got that Riverside recording that you did with somebody from your audience. It was done on the iOS app. You got people to get on their iPhones and talk to you, be part of the podcast that you're putting together. As good as that built-in iPhone mic is, as good as Riverside is, you're probably going to want to clean that audio up. Bouncecast is an easy way to do that. It's got noise removal. It's got a rumble filter. It's got click removal, what we call sticky clicky in the voiceover business, mouth sounds. It's going to remove those for you. EQ, it's got automatic leveling, so you're coming in just as loud as you need to be. You can do one-click export, WAV, MP3, FLAC, any audio format that you want. One click is all it takes to export it. You need batch processing, it can handle that. It's not bad, especially for the price. $59 for life, man. I got a video that shows you how it works, and that video is linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. As I mentioned, the next episode, it's another audio version of Big Podcast Insider. I'm talking all about podcast sponsorships. I'm calling it Podcast Sponsorships 101. That even if you've got advertising and sponsorships on your podcast already, you're going to want to listen to this. It's got some good information on how you can make more money by doing the same work you are now. You're still going to record, you're still going to get your message out, but you're going to take advantage of that leverage that we've got with podcasting. That one podcast episode that you've got, it takes the same amount of work for you to get it to one person as it does 100,000 people. We're going to talk about growing that. That's on the next episode. Here is how to get it. bigpodcast.com/subscribe. bigpodcast.com/subscribe. I've got 3 buttons there, depending on how you listen to podcasts. One for iPhone, one for Android, one via an RSS feed. So if you're old school, you've got something different than the standard iPhone or Android app, I got you covered, man. bigpodcast.com/subscribe. Pick one of those 3, hit it, subscribe, and never miss an episode. Thank you for being here with me. If you got thoughts, comments, you want to reach out, go ahead. bigpodcast.com is where to do that. I appreciate you listening, and I appreciate your support of the book, Big Podcast, the other stuff that I've got going on. It means a lot. And I'll see you on the next episode of Build a Big Podcast.